Coach Harbaugh is no doubt an elite coach, but just how elite? We're going to rank the top coaches in college football and more on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
There's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the front. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific.
Throws it, get it, touchdown, Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him, and a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming, sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his proud daddy, the quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace, and first of all, I just want to say we crossed 10,000 views so far on Facebook on basically word of mouth alone over the 4th of July holiday. Can't thank you enough for the response we've received. Please keep sharing that YouTube link. If you like this week's episode, click the like button, subscribe to our channel here on YouTube. Also, if you're, this is killing my data plan guy, we're on iTunes, we're on Stitcher, we're on Google Play. You can subscribe to Michigan Podcast there as well. Last week's episode made it back into the top 20 again in the college and high school sports category. So we just can't enough say thank you so much for supporting us here on Michigan Podcast. Keep sharing those links. You can follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast as well. In fact, we got some big news for Michigan Podcast. We're going to share that with you towards the end of this week's episode. Well, of course, the college football season is just around the corner. We got a lot of cool trends heading into 2017 for both Michigan, but also the sport in general. We're going to be looking at those later on in this week's episode. But we begin by looking at coaches. There's a reason college football coaches, particularly the really good ones like Jim Harbaugh, get paid all that money because they're worth it. They're the constant. The players come and they go, Hobbs. They come and they go. But the coaching remains. And development, recruiting. You don't just bake the cake in college football. You get to select the ingredients with the players as well. They really are the Polaris, the North Star of the sport. And you can't really identify who the best teams in the sport are without first looking at the best coaches. So we lead off this week with what I think are the best 65 coaches in college football. The reason 65? We took a look at the entirety of the Power Five and then also included Notre Dame as well, which brings us to 65 coaches. And we did this on the basis of a body of work and then the current trend line as well. And we start at the bottom at number 65, and I hate seeing my old buddy Chris Ash there at the bottom. I knew Chris well when he was the defensive backs coach at Iowa State back when I owned the Cyclone publication and website for Scout.com. Great guy, solid coach. Did a tremendous job as the defensive coordinator at both Wisconsin and Ohio State, but he's got a tough gig. If I think there's a coach in that bottom tier group that has the best chance of breaking out in the next couple of years, I'm going to go with Dino Babers at 61. Did a good job at Bowling Green. He's at Syracuse, a program with tradition. He's got a quirky spread air raid offense, which kind of helps you strategically, schematically level the playing field a little bit. And playing games in a dome helps that kind of offense as well. So if we're doing this, if there's enough of you watching Michigan Podcast a couple of years from now, and we're doing the coaching hot board for, say, 2019 or 2020, I think the best case of a name breaking out of this bottom 5 is Dino Babers at Syracuse. In the next group, some really promising young coaches here. I think Steve Adazio at Boston College is all but fired. But you have Tom Allen, did a tremendous job retooling the defense at Indiana. They went from pathetic to pretty respectable last year. He's now the head coach. You have Jeff Brom, who is the former NFL quarterback, former head coach at Western Kentucky. And, you know, the last time Purdue went with a mid-major coach with a pass-happy offense, that worked out pretty well. His name was Joe Tiller. And then a guy I watch very closely because I live here in Iowa is Matt Campbell at Iowa State. Has recruited pretty well by Iowa State standards the last couple of years. They played a lot of tough teams, or top teams in the Big 12. They played tough last year. That's a coach that I think of these 5 has a lot. I'd say him and Tom Allen both have the best chance of moving into the next tier this coming football season. The next 5 in college football, as I rank the coaches 1 through 65 in the entire Power 5, including Notre Dame. Curious name there in Lincoln Riley, the Oklahoma coach. He's got a tough gig. You know, one of the things we'll talk about later on in this week's podcast is Bob Stoops was very successful and a Hall of Famer at Oklahoma, but the job there is a little tougher than you think, and now you're telling me that Lincoln Riley, who 3 years ago was the offensive coordinator at East Carolina, is just going to step right in there? We'll see. And I'm not so sure bringing Ruffin McNeil in for Oklahoma is a great move. Maybe it would have been a good move next year, but Ruffin McNeil is a defensive guy, and I know he's kind of Lincoln Riley's mentor, but, you know, the coach's brother is still the defensive coordinator there, and they're not that great on defense. I could see there being some friction there. And there's 3 coaches that also made a big mark, young coaches last year, taking their teams to bowl games for the first time. Dave Clawson at Wake Forest, Derek Mason at Vanderbilt, and Mark Stoops at Kentucky. I think of those 3, Stoops easily has the best chance of repeating that feat this fall. Next, as we get into the top 50 coaches in college football, Todd Graham at Arizona State on the hot seat, as well as Rich Rodriguez at Arizona. Probably wishing he would have taken that South Carolina job now that Will Muschamp, who's next on the list, took that job last year, got them to a bowl game, and has sort of resurrected his career a little bit. Bronco Mendenhall did a tremendous job at BYU, but last year, the first season of Virginia was a disaster. I think by far the coach that's got the best chance of moving up out of this tier, well, maybe it's Will Muschamp pictured here, because he's got a good young quarterback in Jake Bentley. But I love what DJ Durkin's doing at Maryland, the way he's recruiting. His previous stints as a defensive coordinator at big-time schools was very successful as well. To me, that's the name to watch in this group. Now, starting at number 45, Willie Taggart, going from South Florida to Oregon. I think he steps into a good situation there. They were 4-8 a year ago. I think he could reverse that record this year and be 8-4. Mike McIntyre at Colorado. In my opinion, they're the best season win total under bet on the board. I think Colorado is definitely under 7.5. Ed Orgeron, who did okay. I mean, I know LSU was, I think they were 7-2 last year after he took over, but, you know, really their best effort, guys, was a loss. Their best effort was a loss to Alabama, 10-0. A lot of those games they won were teams they were easily more talented than. Mike Riley, who's trying to resurrect Nebraska, and Lovie Smith. You could argue I have him too high. You could argue I have him too low. It probably depends on if you want to include his NFL success or not. But the name to watch there on this list, I think, is Ed Orgeron, because I think he's unlikely to be better than Les Miles was, because Les Miles was a Hall of Fame coach. More likely, he's going to recruit like a mother the next few years in Baton Rouge. LSU will just kind of wait out when Nick Saban retires, and then they'll go get themselves a coach that can take advantage of the outstanding recruiting that Ed Orgeron did for the last few years. Now we look at the top 40 coaches in college football. Kirby Smart at Georgia. Matt Rule, now at Baylor by way of Temple. P.J. Fleck at Minnesota by way of Western Michigan. Jim Mora Jr. at UCLA, who's definitely on the hot seat. And Clay Helton Helton at USC, who was on the hot seat heading into October and then ended up with a team that finished number 3 in the country, despite the fact they had 3 losses. That's right. Last year, for the first time in the history of college football, a team with 3 losses finished number 3 in the final AP poll. The coach I really like here, I think Kirby Smart's going to crush it at Georgia, maybe as soon as this year, but I'm a PJ Fleck guy. I love his style. I love what he stands for. And I think the contrast he has in a Big Ten West, where you do have a guy in Pat Fitzgerald that has a personality, but he's not at a school that has a lot of resources. They're not a state school. You look at Kirk Ferentz, who's likely a Hall of Fame coach, probably, though, on the downward slope of his career. He's not Mr. Personality. Paul Chryst doing a solid job at Wisconsin, not Mr. Personality. Mike Riley at Nebraska, not Mr. Personality. The one guy who brings a little mustard for that hot dog, who has some charisma in that conference, in that division, in that conference, is PJ Fleck, and I think that's going to pay dividends for him down the road. As we continue counting down the top coaches in college football, Dave Doran faces a make-or-break year at NC State. Hugh Freeze last year at Ole Miss. It was the first time in his career Ole Miss lost fewer games than the year before. Dana Holgorsen at West Virginia, who was on the hot seat heading into last year but won 10 games. Kevin Sumlin at Texas A&M, who was kind of a coaching wunderkind a few years ago, but now just seemingly goes 8-5 every year. And Brett Bielema at Arkansas, who dominated the pre-Urban Meyer, pre-James Franklin, pre-Jim Harbaugh Big Ten, but is struggling to get out of mediocrity in the SEC. A couple of names to watch here in this group. I think Dana Holgorsen's team may surprise at West Virginia this year. When you take a look at Justin Crawford and Will Grier as the offensive backfield, I think they'll be really good. But 2 coaches there at the top in the SEC that are on the hot seat, I think, are Brett Bielema and more so Kevin Sumlin. I mean, Texas A&M has invested essentially $500 million in their football program, and they didn't do it to go 8-5, brother. I can promise you that. Looking at the top 30 coaches now in college football, according to yours truly, Butch Jones at Tennessee. I wasn't sure where to rank him because a lot of us think they missed their window last year, and maybe they did. But you know, in the last 19 games in the SEC, Nick Saban is 18-1. You know who has the second best record? Butch Jones, 15-4. In fact, there's only 9 FBS coaches that have won at least, or only 12 FBF coaches that have won at least 9 games the last 2 years. And Butch Jones is one of them. So I think you can make an argument he's underrated and overrated at the exact same time. Pat Narduzzi at Pittsburgh, David Cutcliffe at Duke, Justin Fuente in his second year at Virginia Tech, and there's Paul Chryst of Wisconsin. With the exception of Narduzzi, the rest of those guys are solid dudes. They don't necessarily light up a living room when they walk in it, though. They're more technicians, tacticians than they are charisma, personality guys. That's what Pat Narduzzi brings to the table. As we continue looking at the top coaches in college football, down to now the top 25. Larry Fedora at North Carolina. Paul Johnson at Georgia Tech. I love the triple option. Tom Herman at Texas. From the group of 5 debuts in the Power 5 at number 23. I think he's walking in to the perfect situation there at Texas. And then the next 2 names. If we had done this podcast last year, Mark D'Antonio and Brian Kelly both would have been in the top 10, maybe D'Antonio in the top 5. So you can make a case that maybe I'm overreacting to how disastrous last year was for both guys. But hey, I mean, I still consider them both top 25 coaches. But I think Tom Herman is going to be the new hotness. I think he will be the next transformational coach in college football. And I think you're going to see that transformation as soon as this year. And so now we look at the top 20 coaches. I've got Jim McElwain at Florida. He's won the SEC East without a quarterback 2 years in a row. Gus Malzahn at Auburn. I think Jarrett Stidham is going to be dynamite for the Tigers this year. James Franklin at Penn State, who took a big leap because of the big leap his program took a year ago. Mike Leach, who's just kind of solid and steady at Washington State. And Dan Mullen at Mississippi State. You can make the argument. He's the second best coach in the SEC, even though he's got one of the toughest jobs in that conference. As we continue looking at the top coaches in college football, we're now down to the top 15. I love Pat Fitzgerald. Here's a crazy stat about Pat Fitzgerald, by the way. Since 1901, Northwestern has had 3 seasons where they've won 10 or more games, okay? Since 1901, Northwestern's only done that 3 times. Pat Fitzgerald either played or coached on every one of those teams. That's how important he is to Northwestern football. Kirk Ferentz from Iowa, now the longest tenured coach in college football, is at number 14. Bobby Petrino at Louisville. Yeah, we know he's got a bit of a reputation, I guess we'll call it, off the field. He's also never won fewer than 8 games in a season as a head coach. Gary Patterson at TCU would have been a top 10 guy last year, but they're kind of losing their identity as a program. They don't play defense the way they used to. They're not as explosive on offense as they once were. And then Mark Richt at Georgia, number 11, averaged 9.5 wins a year at Georgia. I'm sorry, I said Georgia. He's at Miami now. He averaged 9.5 wins at Georgia, and I think he's going to have the U back competing for the ACC and national championships, maybe even again as soon as this year, if they can find a quarterback in Coral Gables. And that takes us to who I think are the top 10 coaches in college football right now. Kyle Whittingham at Utah, I think, is the most underrated coach in the sport, unbeatable in bowl games. And Kyle Whittingham has done 2 things that are tough to do in coaching. One, he took over for the guy. Took over for Urban Meyer at Utah when he walked out the door with an undefeated season and the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. That's tough to do. But then he's also done it changing conferences. They've gone from a mid-major school to a Power 5 school. So that's why I've got Kyle Whittingham in the top 10. Mike Gundy at Oklahoma State has made them a consistent national player, the likes of which they haven't really been since the mid to late 80s. Chris Peterson at Washington, who now clarifies his success at Boise State as not a fluke. What I call the witch. He is just a coaching Jedi master in Bill Snyder, who's a definite Hall of Famer, and David Shaw, who took Jim Harbaugh's program that he built at Stanford that Jim handed him the keys to, and he's even taken it higher than what Jim did when he was there in Palo Alto. So where do I have Coach Harbaugh ranked? We're now at the top 5 coaches in college football, and I start there with our very own Jimmy. And the reason why is, listen, he's number 1 in my heart. He's my all-time favorite Michigan player. When I used to create a player, when I used to create myself back in the day on NCAA football on PlayStation, I always gave myself number 4 because that's the number Jimmy wore, okay? But I got to think critically here, guys. And I know some of you are like, well, he's only number 5. Well, I think that's pretty elite company if you ask me. Like, we had, several slides there. He's on the last one. That means he's in rarefied air. But how do I rank him ahead of guys who have won conference and national championships? I can't do it. Now, I think he's got the potential to go higher, but I'm going to put him at number 5. And my top 4 are the 4 guys that have won national championships. In order, I've got Jimbo Fisher at Florida State 4, Dabo Swinney at Clemson 3. I've got him ahead of Fisher because he's the only coach on the list that's beaten the other 4, or the other 3, that have won national titles. And then you got sort of 1 and 1A. I mean, in any other era, we'd be talking about Urban Meyer as maybe the best coach in the history of the sport, or right up there with the Bear Bryant. But we're not in any other era. We are in a crazy era with what Nick Saban has done at Alabama. And when you consider that Saban has done it in what's probably been the best era of SEC football ever, where the conference won 8 national championships in a row, and they did it with different schools. I mean, Auburn won a national championship. LSU won a national championship. Other teams were competing for national titles. Florida won national championships. So for him to dominate the way he has, what has been the most dominant run we've likely ever seen a conference go on, I just think only adds to the greatness of what Nick Saban has accomplished at Alabama.
He goes back. He's looking for a receiver. He throws downfield to Carter. Carter hands up. Carter is back. Look at those Wolverines. 95 Wolverines.
Next on Michigan Podcast, let's take a look at some trends. 11, in fact, heading into the 2017 season that, whether they continue or whether they're broken, may have a lot to say about how the upcoming college football season turns out. Let's start with this one. The average first-year win improvement for a team with Tom Herman on its coaching staff is 4.3 wins. Offensive coordinator at Iowa State, his first year, they go from 3 wins to 7. Offensive coordinator Ohio State, his first year, they go from 6 wins to 11. Head coach at Houston, his first year, they go from 8 wins to 12. You do the math, that's an average of 4.3 wins of an improvement everywhere he goes. Well, Texas last year, 5 and 7, put on another 4 wins, you're at 9. throw in another game there, you're competing for the Big 12 championship. So that's the first trend to keep an eye on heading into 2017. Here's another, particularly for Michigan fans. You'll find this of interest because this is our opening opponent. Florida is the only SEC team this decade not to average at least 400 yards of total offense for a season. That's the only team. Think about it. Vanderbilt, who is perennially challenged offensively, managed to average 400 yards of offense a season at least once. And yet Florida, with all those athletes they recruit, Jim McElwain, of course, is an offensive guy who's been the head coach the last couple of years, has been unable to do it. Now, they're saying down in Gainesville that this is finally the year he has the offensive personnel he wants. It's just a matter of whether they've got the right quarterback or not. We're going to find out when we face them on September the 2nd. Next trend to take a look at, don't underestimate how great Deshaun Watson was. Last season, with Deshaun Watson, the best player in school history, Clemson won half its games by a touchdown or less. Half its games last year by a touchdown or less. And that wasn't, by the way, with just Deshaun Watson, but Mike Williams, first-round pick at receiver. Artavius Scott, who's on an NFL roster here as training camps get going. Wayne Gallman, who's on an NFL roster here as training camps get going. I mean, they were loaded at the skill positions last year, had the greatest player in school history at quarterback, still won half their games by a touchdown or less. So I think that's a trend to keep an eye on for Clemson, breaking in a new quarterback, and maybe it'll be a true freshman quarterback in Hunter Johnson come September. Next trend. Ohio State has lost 15 players early to the NFL draft the past 2 years. Now, last year, they were dead last on Phil Steele's experience chart and made the college football playoff. When you lose these kinds of players, particularly early, though, it doesn't really, if you're an elite program like in Ohio State, it doesn't really impact your starters that much, right? I mean, how great was their secondary in 2014 and 2015? Eli Apple and all those guys went to the pros. They came right back last year with Malik Hooker and that bunch and Gary and Conley. They were just as good and in some ways statistically better. So when you have that happen 2 years in a row, though, when you have that many underclassmen leave 2 years in a row, your starters are still going to be pretty okay at a school like Ohio State, but depth-wise, that's where it really hurts. One of those guys goes down, who replaces them? That's something to keep an eye on for Ohio State this fall. Next trend, I teased this earlier, talking about why I had Lincoln Riley only ranked 52nd in my coaching rankings. Well, we all agree Bob Stoops is a first-ballot Hall of Famer, right? Of course. Well, then consider this. A first-ballot Hall of Famer named Bob Stoops hadn't had a season with fewer than 2 losses at Oklahoma since 2004, guys. Since 2004. Okay? Like since George W. Bush beat John Kerry. Like before we even knew who Barack Obama was. Like when we were still laughing at the idea of Donald Trump running for president. Okay? That's the last time Bob Stoops had fewer than 2 losses in a season. So if we all agree that Stoops is a first-ballot Hall of Famer, and he couldn't have a season with fewer than 2 losses at Oklahoma since 2004, then why would we expect a guy who was the offensive coordinator at Eastern Carolina 3 years ago and hasn't been a head coach on any level ever, is just going to step right in and not skip a beat? Answer, we shouldn't. Next trend. This is going to blow you away. Nebraska hasn't lost fewer than 4 games in a season since 2002. Since 2002. Since 2002, guys. Isn't that the year that Ang Lee Incredible Hulk movie that everybody hated came out? And when Ben Affleck tried being a superhero the first time, Daredevil, wasn't that somewhere around there? Since 2002. I think Britney Spears was still sane in 2002. That's the last time Nebraska lost fewer than 4 games in a season. And when you consider from 1968 to 2002, Nebraska never won fewer than 9 games. That tells you what has happened to their program in the last 15 years or so. Our next trend, USC 3 times since 2007. That's just the last decade now. USC has been a preseason top 5 team. Only one of those years did the Trojans finish in the top 20. Only once. One year they finished number 5. Another year they finished number 22. Back in 2012 with Matt Barkley, they were the preseason number 1 team, became the first ever preseason number 1 team in the AP poll to finish with 6 losses. So you can say, well, that's an outlier. Well, what about the other 2 times? One time they finished number 5, but that's pretty good. But the other time they finished outside the top 25. So keep that in mind as we're reading about USC being everybody's preseason playoff pick. Next trend we want to keep an eye on heading into this season. Penn State coach James Franklin has never had a preseason top 10 team in his career. Remember, came from Vanderbilt. Now, I mean, come on, the guy won 9 games consecutive seasons at Vanderbilt, right? That's like probably the best Nick Saban could do at Vanderbilt. That's incredibly impressive. So I don't want to take anything away from James Franklin at all, but it's a lot different building a program with no expectations than it is year in and year out dealing with those expectations. He hasn't done it yet. Well, he's going to get his chance to show us he can do it this year at Penn State. How about this one? I had to do a lot of research on this. Michigan State had an 8-game collapse last season from the previous year. A Power 5 team hadn't suffered that big of a 1-year collapse since Louisville in 1962. And that's the furthest back I could go and get reliable records. And in fact, in 1962, Louisville was in the Missouri Valley Conference, a football conference that isn't FBS anymore. So you can make a case that it's even going back further than that. It's just Louisville's considered a Power 5 team now. And I had to go back over 50 years, over a half century, guys. That just shows you how epic last year's collapse by Michigan State truly was. Notre Dame, last year, 5 of Notre Dame's 8 losses in 2016 were games they scored at least 28 points. 4 of their losses were by a field goal or less. This is why I think they're going to have some kind of bounce back this year. If you're a longtime reader of Phil Steele's college football, you know there's 3 metrics he likes more than any other. One is turnovers. Right, he points out that if you were great turnovers one year, it likely goes against you the next year. And if you were terrible one year, it likely goes for you the next. He likes that stat. He likes offensive line starts. That's another stat Phil Steele likes a lot. Here's the third. Did you have a lot of close losses the year before? Notre Dame did. So if you're losing 4 games by a field goal or less, basically what you need to do the next year, if you can improve defensively by 1 to 2 possessions a game, you're going to win almost all those games. I think they can do that. That's a pretty low bar, actually, for a university of their caliber that recruits annually the way they do. So I think that's the biggest reason why you'll see Notre Dame have somewhat of a turnaround, because the odds they're going to lose that many close games again, they're going to lose that many games, they score at least 28 points again 2 years in a row, it's just really not that high. It rarely happens. Math doesn't work. And our final trend, Michigan's last Big Ten title was in 2004. That is the second longest conference title drought in the program's history. Can Michigan end that drought this year with such a young team, maybe the youngest team in all of Power 5 in college football? We find out starting September 2nd.
Stay away from Big Gabe Watson in there, and at some point, Michigan is going to line up and play man-to-man coverage, and you have to beat man-to-man.
Here's Sutton, breaks 1 tackle, cuts it back inside, fumbles the ball, and it's picked up by Michigan. Leon Hall, and he's going to take it the distance. 20, 10, 5, touchdown, 83 yards.
A freshman running back is still a freshman running back. Right here, Tyrell Sutton. The ball just pops out. It looked like number 29. Obviously, Leon Hall picks the football up and returns it for a touchdown.
Leon Hall made the hit, but I'm not so sure that a fellow Northwestern player didn't knock it out of his hands, Bob.
All right, if you're a stat nerd, if you're a data nerd like me, then this week's episode of the Michigan Podcast, man, this one's for you, right? So I told you we had 11 trends last segment. Well, I fibbed. We actually have 12. We have 1 trend to rule them all. This is the biggest trend of them all to watch heading into 2017. Are you ready? Here we go. The last 5 years in a row, a team unranked in the preseason AP poll has either challenged for the national title or a playoff berth. Let me repeat that. 5 years in a row, a team unranked in the preseason AP poll either challenged for a national title or a playoff berth. Let's take a look at what's gone down the last 5 years. We start last year, Penn State. You know what? They didn't receive a single vote in the preseason AP poll, guys. Not a single vote. Yet they finished just one spot out of the playoffs in the final playoff rankings at number 5. And a lot of people think they deserve to be in, and I agree. Next, how about 2015? Iowa was unranked in the preseason. They played for a playoff berth in the Big Ten championship game that year. Remember, if it wasn't for a second, third, fourth, fifth effort by L.J. Scott there, that phenomenal one-yard run on the goal line, Iowa would have had a goal line stand there and been in the college football playoff that year, then they could have been the team that lost 49-3 to Alabama like Sparty did. But that would have been a hell of an accomplishment for the Iowa Hawkeyes, no question about that. 2014, Mississippi State, unranked in the preseason, yet they went on to become the first number 1 team ever. That, if you want to win a trivia contest at a bar the rest of your life, this is the one. Who was the first ever number 1 team in the college football playoff rankings? The answer, no one's going to get this. It's Mississippi State was. In fact, they were number 1 for several weeks. They started 10-0 before they lost their last 2 games that year to Alabama and then Ole Miss in the Egg Bowl. And then in 2013, Auburn, unranked in the preseason, made it all the way to the final BCS championship game. And then 2012, Notre Dame, unranked in the preseason, also made it all the way to the BCS national championship game. So 5 years in a row, we have seen a team not ranked in the preseason AP poll go on to contend for either a national championship or a berth in the college football playoff. So as we take a look at who those teams could be in 2017, I've narrowed it down to a few that I think are the most likely. Let's take a look at who those teams are. I think there's 5 possibilities. First possibility is Texas. They return a ton. 16 starters, a quarterback, and Shane Buechele, who was the number 1 rated quarterback at the Manning Passing Academy last month. They've got a ready-made roster for a coach known for inspiring huge first-year turnarounds in his teams. So I think Texas is a candidate very likely to not be ranked in the preseason AP poll and have a chance to shock us all when we get to December. How about Northwestern? Returns one of the best offensive backfields in the Big Ten. You look at Northwestern's schedule, you see a lot of games that could go either way. I don't look at Northwestern's schedule, all 12 games. I don't see one game that I'm thinking, hey, that's your rake your lawn Saturday this year, Team Purple. You're not winning that one. I'm not saying they're going to go 12-0, but I think all those games are winnable. And if you're going to play a lot of 21-17, 24-21, 28-24 kind of games, and when you've got the best quarterback, running back tandem on the field, because those two guys touch the football more than anybody else, you got a chance to win a lot of those games. So I think Northwestern's a team that may not be ranked in the preseason AP top 25 to keep an eye on to continue this trend. How about NC State? One of the best defensive lines in college football. Ryan Finley really developed at quarterback last year, throwing for over 3,000 yards. That's a team that may not be ranked in the preseason AP poll that could end up challenging for a berth in the college football playoff. Now, the problem they have is the division they're in, right? So you got the Heisman Trophy winner, you've got the defending national champions, and one of the 4 or 5 best programs in the last half or 30 years of college football staring up at you in that same division. So that's why that's what's working against NC State there, being that surprise team. And then you have UCLA. Josh Rosen is healthy again, and you just can't see them struggling with the injury bug like that 2 years in a row. So that's another team that I think has the makings and earmarkings of the kind of squad that can continue that trend in 2017. But here's the biggest dark horse of them all. Keep an eye on BYU. Most of their toughest games are at home. They play LSU on a neutral site in Houston, where they will bring a ton of fans there, just like LSU will. Remember, it was a few years ago they played Oklahoma with the Heisman Trophy winner and Sam Bradford in one of those neutral site games there, and they beat them in that game, right? And LSU likes to play that downhill physical style. Well, you know, BYU's guys all come back looking like Merlin Olsen off a 3-year Mormon mission. They all look like they're 30. They're all married. They've got kids. They're playing in college funds. Those guys are grown men. They are going to be physically developed to take on that sort of downhill running scheme for LSU. And Tanner Mangum at quarterback. Remember that he was the kid who was the freshman that threw the Hail Mary pass that beat Nebraska a couple years ago? Well, he's more in line of what Ty Detmer wants to. Yeah, he's the offensive coordinator at BYU now. That's how old we are. He's more in line of the kind of offense they want to run. BYU, keep an eye on them as a team that can go from unranked in the preseason to a team that could end up, as we sit here in mid to late November, challenging for the playoffs. If I had to pick the teams most likely on that list to be that team, I'd pick BYU or Texas.
With this wind is really active. You throw your short stuff, which is Michigan, going into the wind. You throw your short stuff when you're going into the wind. Throw your long stuff 2 quarters when you're with the wind.
Hayden Epstein, you can see, averages almost 40 yards a boot. Eugene Wilson is the single safety for the Fighting Illini. And it's a fake. Running right up the middle is Cross, and Cross in the secondary breaks the tackle at the 35, and he's free. He'll take it all the way down to the 17-yard line.
Had to see something in the tapes of Illinois early in the season in one of their first 3 ball games to get this wide open. Walter Cross, the up back, the snap was right to him, and they really opened this thing up. Punter does a good job of faking like it went over his head, and then you see Walter Cross against Eugene Wilson in the secondary. Good call. And Ron, with this wind, that is an excellent call, because if you punt, it's not going to go that far anyway.
All right, this week's Twitter poll results on the Michigan podcast. We asked you, Michigan's over-under win total in Vegas is 8.5. Are you taking the over or the under? I guess we should not be shocked. That 75% of our followers at Michigan Podcast took the over. If anything, we should be shocked the number's not higher. All right, I guess we can say 75% of our followers are Michigan fans. The other 25% of you are not. That's probably how that broke down. And that brings us to this week's question of the week. And don't forget, tweet us at Michigan Podcast or find us on Facebook if you want us to answer your question on an upcoming episode here. Nezzy21 on Twitter wants to know, is Wilton Speight the modern-day John Navarre? Now, I get this. You know, they're both really tall white guys. Okay, I get this. But that's pretty much where the comparisons end. I mean, Navarre, I believe, was a tight end defensive end in high school who transitioned to quarterback. Spate's been a quarterback all along. Secondly, Spate's a lot better athlete than John Navarre. Now, he may not end up being as good a quarterback. I mean, John Navarre is the last quarterback at Michigan to win an undisputed Big Ten championship, so take nothing away from him. And he set a lot of Michigan passing records when he left school that Chad Henne broke in the next few years after his departure. But Speight is a lot better athlete. I mean, you watch Spate's mobility last year. He seemed to, at times, throw better out of the pocket on the run and make more plays that way than he did actually in the pocket. So from an accomplishment standpoint, I'd take Wilton Speight being the next John Navarre right now, right? Big Ten champion, set a whole bunch of school passing records. I think we would take that right now as Michigan fans if we could. So from a resume standpoint, we're kind of hoping he's the next Wilton Speight. But in terms of physical gifts, other than they're both tall and white, they don't really have too many comparisons from that point forward.
On a 25-second.
Brown's the quarterback, and in the category of understatement, this is the ball game. 4th and 3. Lots of time. To the end zone for Colasar.
Touchdown.
Touchdown!
So this is a cool video. We finally found somebody that can take down Jim Harbaugh. This is video from him somehow getting the point of view as he's on the raft there with his daughters. And now the takedown. There it is. One of the daughters takes him down underwater. You finally found who can take down Jim Harbaugh. It takes another Harbaugh to take down Coach Harbaugh. All right, couple of quick notes. First of all, my 2017 college football preview is what we're going to discuss next week on the podcast. If you can't wait until then, you can read the whole thing right now at MichiganPodcast.com. Again, MichiganPodcast.com, and we'll break it down for you on next week's episode. Also, I mentioned a big announcement. If you are a subscriber to SiriusXM, we're going to be filling in Saturday on College Sports Nation, the big college sports channel on SiriusXM. We're going to be filling in Saturday night, July 15th, from 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern. That's right, Michigan Podcast is going global via SiriusXM, so hopefully you'll get a chance to tune in to us then. Don't forget, follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. Like us on Facebook. Go Blue, and we'll see you next week.